The history of nuclear testing is connected to the history of colonialism. Countries tend to test nuclear weapons in the farthest reaches of their empires among people with no political power. So the Soviet Union tested in Kazakhstan, the UK tested in Australia, the UK tested also in islands in the Pacific. The United States tested smaller weapons in Nevada, but tested large thermonuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. Most of these communities still define themselves in relationship to this colonial power. They're very isolated places. So people in Kazakhstan define themselves as victims of Soviet nuclear testing. People in the Marshall Islands define themselves as victims of US nuclear testing. People in Algeria or in French Polynesia define themselves as victims of French nuclear testing. And so in many of these communities, they don't realize that there are lots of other communities in the world who have this similar history that they have. So we want to help to move these communities to more of a global identity, so that through creating linkages between these communities, their voices can become louder and can become one global voice, asking for remediation and asking for justice and expressing their history, rather than several little voices in separate places. So there's many aspects to that project that I'm happy to talk about. But part of what I want to talk about is some of the common experiences of radiation-affected communities and how that relates to the people in northern Japan. That these communities have in common their experiences. Of course, the most obvious is health problems and death. In almost all of these communities, there are people suffering from sickness, suffering cancer, suffering immune disorders, suffering other radiation-related diseases. So this is obviously the most important effect of radiation exposure on these communities. What we're interested in looking at in our project is the social and the cultural fallout, the social and the cultural impacts on these communities, because they're often discounted, because the health impacts are large, and they're critical, and they need to be addressed. So some of the social and the cultural impacts are left behind because they're not nearly as dire. But they are very important, and they have a great effect on communities. And they also have an effect that can ripple forward for generations, just like radiation effects can ripple forward for generations. So among the different effects that I mentioned are, first and foremost, dislocation from traditional lands. This has a very, very big effect on people. People often are removed from their traditional homes because these areas are contaminated with radiation. When you remove a community from its traditional home, all kinds of social breakdowns follow that. Some of those social breakdowns include disruption of traditional lifestyles. So you have people who have been, for 10 generations or more, have been fishermen, have been farmers, have been ranchers, and they have worked on the same land that their parents have worked on, their grandparents have worked on, that their ancestors have worked on. So they have a close connection to this land. And when you remove people from this land, a lot of these connections become severed, and a lot of social consequences follow. Some of them are, for example, a change in diet. In the Marshall Islands, people who have lived a lifestyle connected primarily to fishing and a little bit of fruit growing become refugees. They become removed from, for example, the people of Rongelap were removed from their atoll after radiation exposures in 1954, and they live now as refugees on other people's islands, other people's atolls in the Pacific. Because they no longer are landholders, they don't have the same rights to fishing, and they don't have the same rights to farming that they used to have. So many of them become dependent on food handouts from the US government. As a result, their diets change and their health changes dramatically. You see a rise of diabetes, you see a rise of all kinds of diet-related illnesses. And you see also dependence on, for those few communities that have received some compensation for their exposure or for their loss of land, you see a dependence on this compensation, and you see the breakdown of traditional skills, and no longer are these skills passed on from generation to generation. The way I put this in a context for Fukushima and for Tohoku is one way to understand it is the traditional Japanese holiday of Obon. Obon is a holiday in which one's ancestors are honored. And it's a holiday in which Japanese people return to the village where their families come from, the town where their families come from. And the graves of the ancestors are cleaned and decorated, and rituals and songs welcome the spirits of the ancestors back to come back to earth. And there's a sense that, and there's a belief that the spirits of the ancestors return to earth for a few days in order to join together with the family, and the family honors them. The world that we live in today is built on the work of our ancestors and built on the hard lives of our ancestors, and so honoring them is one way to obtain their blessing, which ensures our wellness and our sustenance and our well-being. So this ritual may have gone on for hundreds of years or longer for people who have lived for generation after generation in a certain place. But when you look back on your life and you see this chain has been held together and there's been continuity for hundreds of years through famines, through all kinds of difficult times, all of your ancestors have managed to uphold this ritual and uphold this honoring of ancestors, and you are the one who broke it. It's in your lifetime that it broke, and it's in your lifetime that all of these ancestors no longer have that sense of honor and respect from their descendants. After a lifetime where you fail to uphold these rituals, you begin to blame yourself. Or earlier, you begin to blame yourself. And people suffer from depression. People suffer from a lot of psychological distress because they are the ones who have broken a chain that goes back as far as they can remember. These types of consequences don't get addressed when people are evacuated and when people cannot return to their homes. There is no attempt, first of all, to provide any kind of mental health assistance to these communities, and there's no attempts to set up alternate rituals whereby people can feel that they are in some measure completing and upholding their obligations to their ancestors. So these sorts of rituals, which are a normal part of how life cycles all around the world, they break. And people feel disconnected from their past. They feel disconnected from their ancestors. They feel disconnected from the land that their ancestors may have farmed for generations, for many generations. They feel disconnected from the same seas that their ancestors fished in and the same places where their ancestors brought fish into port. And many parts of their well-being begin to break down along with it. When you take people who have lived on land for many generations, and their identity is that they're a farmer, and their ancestors were farmers, and they farmed this same plot of land, and suddenly they're living as a refugee in an apartment somewhere in the outskirts of Tokyo, or they're living in some community center waiting for housing somewhere else, that their sense of self, I'm a farmer, this is who I am. They're no longer a farmer, they're a refugee now. They're somebody who is disconnected from land. They're somebody who lives in an apartment. They're not somebody who farms the land that their ancestors farmed. People begin to lose hope and get depression, and there are tremendous psychological consequences for this dislocation. If there are further terrible things that happen at Fukushima Daiichi, for example, the collapse of the reactor number 4 building and the spent fuel pool leaking or collapsing, there will be evacuations of hundreds of thousands or even millions more. These people will be living far from where their identity is connected. The communities around this plant are no longer communities. The ways in which people could count on their neighbors to help them when they were in trouble, to help them with work, to watch their children, all of these communities fragment, the people spread, and people become isolated. And they no longer have social resources. They no longer have the social resources that maintain small communities. Now there are just people living as refugees. Now there are just people lost in a suburb or lost in an apartment building, perhaps living on a subsidy from the government because of the loss of their land, and their ability to take care of themselves breaks down. Nuclear power, however, is an industry. Nuclear power is a business. Nuclear power depends to some extent on public support, on putting down or quieting public opposition. So when people are exposed to radiation from a nuclear power plant accident, additional things happen that are abusive of those people. In Fukushima, in this incident, we have a situation where, and also the government of Japan knew that there were 3 full meltdowns the first week of this incident. They knew there were meltdowns the first couple days. They knew they had 3 full meltdowns by the end of that week. They lied for months to people. They lied for 2 months. The reason they lied was to keep the word meltdown out of the headlines. During the week when it happened, there's all of this hysterical media covering it. Oh, are these plants going to melt down? And they would say, well, we believe maybe 2% of the fuel has melted. So they would say this when they know that the full core has melted. Maybe 4% of the fuel has melted. We're not sure. Possibly some has melted, but we're not certain some has melted. They say this, they know it has melted. So these are lies. They're absolutely lies. The primary reason for this was that while the attention of the press is focused, they try not to use the word meltdown. They try to keep the word meltdown off of the headlines. 2 months later, when TEPCO admits, a little over 2 months later, when TEPCO admits there were 3 full meltdowns at Fukushima, it is not a front page story in the newspapers anywhere around the world. In some newspapers in Japan, but nowhere else around the world. It's a story on page 10. It's a story on page 20. That's success from their point of view. This is public relations success, which is an interview with a housewife in Japan called Coming Back from a Radiation Panic. The introduction says, even for people living somewhere far away, the Fukushima nuclear accident caused hurt to individuals and threw society into chaos. Notwithstanding the fact that currently in Japan, health risks from radiation are very small, some people have fallen into a panic. Though these people who cause untold grief to both their families and children are indeed victims, at the same time, they may also be aggressors who blacken the reputation and discriminate against the affected areas. These people are put in a position where they're lied to. They're not given information about where things are safe, where things are not safe. The permissible amount of radiation exposure for children and for people is raised. So all of these things are happening around them. Of course, these people are going to be confused. These people are not confused because they have unnatural fear of radiation. They're being confused because they're being lied to. Their lives are affected. They don't know if they're in danger. They don't understand radiation. Most people don't understand the nature of radiation. They're being given false information. They're even being moved into areas with higher contamination. Then some period later, after they have been exposed to significant amounts of radiation, then they're evacuated. But they're told that there was no danger, but they're told they might be able to go back to their homes. They don't know. Maybe they can go back to their homes, maybe they can't go back to their homes. Many people believe that they can return to their homes, maybe in a year, maybe in 2 years or 3 years. They're given false hope. So they're living in limbo. They're living in some in-between place. They don't want to start a new life. They want to go back to their home. The Japanese panel yesterday saying that Fukushima was largely a man-made disaster.